Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Kevin, for the introduction. It's an honor for MCLAUGHLIN to be here this year, part of the summit, kicking off our discussion on growing small business. As some of you may know, MCLAUGHLIN is one of Canada's largest engineering and construction companies, supporting more than 5,000 jobs here in Ontario, 28,000 people across Canada, and 44,000 people around the world. What many of you may not know is that MCLAUGHLIN was established 104 years ago in 1911 by a young entrepreneur, self-starter by the name of Arthur Surveyor, who back in 1911 left his job with the federal government of Canada and took on the risk of starting a small business. And if you look back at his biographical information at the time, his concerns in 1911 were twofold. One, would he be able to get access to resources that would support his business through the first couple of years, knowing that there would be his fair share of ups and downs? And secondly, it was simply getting an opportunity to demonstrate to the large contractors that his firm was the one to bring on board in order to make projects happen. Fast forward 104 years, and I don't think even Arthur Surveyor would have foreseen a company that supports projects across a real diverse landscape of infrastructure, resources, and power projects. A main ingredient of all those projects is small and medium-sized companies, 6,500 of them in our supply chain around the world that are a hugely key ingredient for reaching our objectives in all our projects. So I think all of us in this room know that that sector is not only hugely important to the economic activity that we see across the country today and in Ontario, but also going to be an increasingly important driving force for economic growth and innovation going forward. So knowing how important this discussion is, I'll hand the baton back to our co-chair, Kevin LYNCH. And in the meantime, thank you for your time this morning and have a great summit.
So our first panel this morning, and so I wonder if we're going to talk about strengthening and enabling Ontario business. So I wonder if I can have my three panelists join me on the stage. Bilal, Michael, and Neil. As they're coming up, Michael, which chair are you going to sit in? All right. I'm just reading the notes in the order they are. My far left, now that I know where he is, Michael KATCHEN, the founder and CEO of Wealthsimple. Michael has done a number of things in the startup phase. He led the marketing at 1,000 Memories, a Silicon Valley startup that was acquired by Ancestry.com, which anybody who's ever turned on to TV or kind of sat on a plane and looked at the screen is kind of well aware of the enormous things it does for you. Wealthsimple is Canada's fastest growing online investment manager, but I'm sure Neil and his colleagues at the Royal Bank and elsewhere are working on catching up. Mike was recently listed as an industry mover by the Financial Post. He's been cited in a number of others. And for a number of years, 3-4, Michael worked at McKinsey, and before that, Black's kind of camera as a strategist in the whole kind of putting photography online and using it. So great to have you. Next to him, Bilal Khan is the managing director of OneEleven. OneEleven is an organization that is building a community of high technology, entrepreneurial-driven entrepreneurs. It is kind of part of the OMERS kind of group, one of our large incubators here in the Toronto area. And Bilal, you certainly would kind of live in that world of the innovators last night and the founders. Be interesting to kind of hear your views. Before that, he was a director of policy with a number of ministers in Ontario. He was in 2010 named one of the rising city builders in Toronto by the group Diverse City. And it's great to have you. And on my immediate left is Neil McLaughlin, who's the Executive Vice President, Business Financial Services for the Royal Bank of Canada. Neil's been with the Royal Bank of Canada since 1998, has been in the credit card kind of business and the personal lending, now the small business and others. So I think well situated to talk about some of the issues of kind of financing and growth that we're going to talk about today. He's also on the board of the Children's Wish Foundation of Ontario, which is great. It's great to see the community service as well as the entrepreneurship and business of our panels. Can I have a round of applause to welcome our panel? Now, I've asked them each to start off with 35-minute opening remarks. No. In fact, what I suggested is we don't have any opening remarks, and we go right to a common question to everyone on the panel. And it goes essentially to the growth issue that's talking around. If you look at growth in Canada, it's about 1% this year. Ontario is doing better, but it's doing better than a very bad kind of benchmark. Most folks looking to next year see growth in Canada well under 2%, and it's a volatile, risky growth, as Lise was saying. We've got less than 12% of our SMEs in Ontario do any trading outside of Canada, and yet exporting, as Elise said, is one of the key characteristics of success. And in all that, increasingly, there are commentators in Ontario and Canada that say that we have a structural growth problem, that this isn't a short-term cycle thing, this is a longer-term kind of growth issue. I guess my question to the panel, and be interesting to get questions back from the audience later on, is do you agree? And if so, how do we actually shake up growth for both the SME community and more generally whether it's startups? So that's the question. Do we have a growth problem? And if so, what do we do about it? Start at the far end. Mike.
Sure. I mean, I can certainly speak to our experience in the startup community, which I think is anything but a growth problem. I think, I grew up in Toronto, but then I moved to California about 5 years ago to build a business out there. And in the time that before I left to coming back, it's amazing to see what's happened in the startup community. I think BILAL is probably the best position here to talk about it. But in our business, we've gone from a team of 0 to 30 in a year. We've raised $32 million in capital. We're growing the business about 10% a week today. And if anything, I see a tremendous amount of peers in the startup community that are still in the small business stage, less than 100 people in their businesses, less than $50 million in revenue today, but certainly a tremendous trajectory to their growth and huge ambitions for the sorts of businesses they want to build. So I think in my small bubble of a community, I don't see that, but certainly you hear about it across kind of more traditional industries.
Okay, thanks. Bilal?
Yeah, I think to Michael's point, I think there's a fundamental difference between SMEs and startups. And then within the category of startups, there is early stage startups, and then there's growth-oriented startups. And the big difference here is that startups are designed inherently to scale. And so the moment that startup finds finds product market fit and finds a scalable business model, that growth trajectory changes significantly. And it's kind of like a hockey stick type of growth. And so you start to see massive growth as soon as they hit that trajectory. Whereas with SMEs, they're inherently designed to be sustainable. And so there's sustainability and long-term growth. And so I think part of the challenge we face is that we tend to put startups into the policy discussions with SMEs, and they are fundamentally different. And so I think we need to start thinking about startups, and particularly scalable startups, and understand their particular circumstances, the challenges they face, the tax implications of that type of growth differently than we do our traditional SME sector.
Neil, you straddle all those sectors.
Sure. So I think I agree with everything that's been said. I guess when we think about growth, I mean, if you go back to your comments, we definitely have sort of economic headwinds in terms of low growth that we're in right now. I think what we get into is what is going to be the next engine in terms of the previous comments. But we have a low growth environment. We have a stagnant labor market when we really sort of back out immigration. So I would sort of break it down into a couple of things. I think we have this big economic headwinds that we're dealing with, and the comments about uncertainty I think were absolutely spot on, or volatility, and I think that leads to an awful lot of uncertainty and becomes an impediment for growth. But I think if we sort of peel that back, we need to sort of de-average what's going on. I think you go sort of to the crisis, and what we saw was smaller firms actually we saw continue to increase right through the crisis, but we did see a real step back in terms of medium and larger size companies, and medium-sized companies shrinking into smaller companies. So I think we're still absorbing some of that as an economy. But I think the positive piece is small firms continue to grow and grow and grow. So I think that sort of ties it back to say, is there a growth problem? The macroeconomic pieces would say whether it's uncertainty, it's sort of sluggish. I think if we look at the sort of the Canadian entrepreneur, that's where the buoyant sort of attitude I think would come from. I think it's some of the attitudes we've just heard talked about, but sort of Canadian entrepreneurialism feels alive and well, and the ambition seems to be on the real upswing. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. We have to sort of de-average it and get underneath and look at whether it's top-line sort of economic drivers or what do we see in terms of business starts and exits. And that's actually been a very positive trend for the last 5 or 6 years. We're actually adding 15,000 sort of small and medium companies per year. So there's the fundamentals, sort of the global economic fundamentals feel like strong headwinds. I think we've got sort of Canadian businesses really trying to do their part to really kickstart things. And I think some of the most exciting are going to be some of the trends I'm sure we'll talk about. But in Ontario, the manufacturing, one of the industries hit the hardest during the crisis, really I think being replaced by the digital economy and some of the things we just talked about in terms of whether it's startups, but this digital economy is an opportunity for us.
Great. So if we had a lot more startups and entrepreneurs, we do better, because the tone is very different if you go to established enterprises, right? So it's really interesting, Neil, you highlighted that. If you flip back to last night, and many folks were here, so we had 4 founders, startups, and just to pick some of the factors that they said were either impediments or important. So let's kind of get at this. They cited, 1, the importance of partnerships with universities on the technology side. They talked about the difficulty of financing and drew contrast between Canada and the United States. They talked about persistence as being crucial to success. They talked about, and it was fascinating, kind of that innovation is essentially about solving problems for customers. And it's not about technology in the first instance, it's about a problem that you can solve with technology, and then about the importance of marketing. I mean, whether it's that list or others, that was our conversation last night. How do you see those factors? Would you add, subtract? How big are they? How do we actually make the entrepreneur not the exception in Ontario, but the rule in Ontario? Bilal, let me start with you, and I'll change the order around.
Yeah. So I mean, listen, being an entrepreneur it's incredibly difficult. And so all odds are against you. It's an incredibly steep ride. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, when we talk about startups, we're talking about high growth technology startups. So to find that inflection point of growth is challenging. As it relates to capital, there's a capital conversation that seems to always happen at these types of conversations. I don't think there's a big capital problem. From a public policy perspective, we started to open up the border. So we've got every major investment fund in the Valley investing in Canadian technologies. In fact, they're investing more and more. I don't know, Mike might be humble about this, but Mike, within a year and a half, started his company, raised an initial $2.4 million seed round, and within, I think, 9 months, raised $30 million thereafter. Capital is available and it's accessible. I think entrepreneurs need to hustle. They need to show value, and they need to show kind of growth in order to achieve that. What I do think there is a challenge that exists in our ecosystem. It's around regulation and regulatory burden. And Kevin, I think you brought up a great point that it was around risk averse versus
Risk management.
Risk management, and I think that's really important. And particularly in certain sectors that we have an unfair advantage with. We've got one of the most stable and largest financial services sectors in the world. And the intersection between financial services and technology, particularly fintech, is an incredibly huge opportunity. But we still have a regulatory system, and particularly the Securities Commission, that lives and breathes based on precedent. And the reality is we're living in an unprecedented world. And so in order to be able to adopt and compete globally, we need to start thinking about the future and start taking some chances while still protecting investors and protecting consumers ultimately.
Neil, from your perspective, what are the things that drive startups, entrepreneurship?
Yeah,
Is that list or others?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to pick up on Bilal's comments. I would agree with all of those. I think maybe just to start with regulation. I think what you have right now is, we talked about Uber and Airbnb as disruptors. I think the regulatory framework is right now, struggling to stay abreast of what's really going on in the new economy, and that's creating wrinkles for everybody. And you just have to look at the debates we had in the GTA around Uber and sort of Uber's sort of global sort of walk around the globe in terms of what does that look like. But they are pushing, and I think we need to see them continue to push to really move regulation into the new digital reality. And that's I think going to be a challenge for us going forward. I think the other thing is just sort of everybody across the ecosystem really sort of understanding that these new firms are coming in and they're not starting with a set of assets and what can I do with these assets and trying to build a business. They're starting with the customer in mind and working from the customer out and saying, what is a customer looking for? What is a really terrible experience that I think I can build an entirely new business model around with zero regard for what it looks like now or anybody who's been part of that legacy to create that bad experience. And that's a completely different framework than I think we've seen businesses built on or expand in the past. And I think what you're remaking some of these business models, and you're leading to very buoyant growth patterns. So I think understanding that's the way a lot of these new businesses are being formed. And it's creating disruption, it's creating risk for other firms who aren't able to keep up or maybe tied to sort of the legacy of that historical business. When I think about sort of the factors for success, I think it's an entire ecosystem that we need to think about, and financial services included. I think we talked a little bit about universities, but universities and thinking about young entrepreneurs and millennials and the types of businesses they're going to want to start, and how do we increasingly entangle them with the private sector and think about more co-ops and get them started earlier, and just bring sort of entrepreneurism right into the university would be one. But I think universities or education and regulation, and we can continue to go across the players of the ecosystem, but I think it's got to be a combination.
Mike, how do we make your firm the size of Facebook?
Yeah, working on it. Yeah, I think, I don't want to repeat what everyone said here, but I agree. I think what I love so much about the remarks that started this morning in this room here is I do think a big part of what's enabled us to get to where we are today, and though I feel like we're just scratching the surface on what I see as a massive opportunity, is bringing together government and industry to help a startup be successful. I mean, when we launched our business, we went to the OSC, which traditionally has been a very risk management or risk averse sort of organization. We told them what we wanted to do, which was we want to make investing more accessible, lower cost, more transparent for Canadians. You have to support that mandate. Now let's work with you to figure out what parameters have to be true to make this protecting average investors out there, and we do it in the right framework. When we went to the industry and we went to Power Financial, one of the largest financial services sort of corporations in the country, we talked about we wanted to create a new sort of model that was servicing younger investors. 80% of our clients are under 45, which is the inverse of the financial services industry. So we're touching a whole different segment of the market that nobody's touching today. How can we work together to address this market and solve a real problem? And they had the capital that we needed to make that a reality. So for us, a big part of success to date has been working with the Securities Commission and government to create a model that makes sense. Working with the industry to get the resources and capital required to build a business. And third, and I think the challenge that we most struggle with today is hiring the right talent to scale the business. I spend at least 50% of my time today on hiring. It's hard to build a team from 0 to 30 in a year, and to really build it with world-class talent, and to continue trying to scale that and build a culture and an organization around it as you do it. So support on that would be a huge, huge help.
That's actually from our clients. When we talk to our clients, talent comes up as sort of one of the top 3 impediments that they're trying to work through. Input costs, obviously, but I think the conversation immediately goes to sort of capital, and we would see that sort of into the sort of lower into the top 10 repeatedly. But talent is always really top of the heap.
I was at a World Economic Forum FinTech conference in New York recently, and some of your competitors now from the Valley were talking. It was fascinating. One of them actually made a really interesting point about the difference between startups and established, which is that established firms, no particular sector, in a sense, use technology to enhance their existing business models. And startups use technology to disrupt the existing business model. Is that a fair characterization of the difference?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say, just a fundamental way that people can conceptualize this, I think most established companies refer to their technology groups as IT, and it's still considered a cost center in the business. For us, 50% of our team are software engineers, They are absolutely the most important people in the company, the highest paid people in the company, and the hardest to recruit. They are the things that enable us to create new experiences. And to give you a very specific example, when we launched our business a year and a half ago, I think 90% or more of investment accounts in this country were still open with pen and paper. It would take weeks. You'd have to actually either mail it in as a big package, a stack of paperwork, or you'd have to walk it into a bank branch to get it done. Within a year and a half, we created the first mobile app that lets you sign up for an investment account, fund it within 10 minutes on your phone. And you can't do those sorts of things without software engineers that are really rethinking what's possible and have the tools and capability to actually build the solutions. So, our focus on building and having, being a technology-driven sort of firm has enabled us to do those sorts of things.
Can I ask a little bit, you talked, Bilal, about the difference between startups and existing firms. And as much as we want more and more and more startups, the great base of our economy, as you said, Neil, is existing firms. And so I guess what I was going to ask next is, how do we actually generate more change in the approach in existing firms? In other words, how do we get out of holding to the status quo and try and get more kind of action? And if I have any luck here getting a cartoon up for you, I will. There it is. And I think the biggest fear about change is the fear of change itself. And the left-hand side is a great cartoon from the New Yorker, which is the reality is innovation and everybody is running from it. And the right-hand side, I think, is our biggest Canadian problem is complacency. How do you folks see that from different? And how do we get the established firms thinking? I have no problem with it, Mike, you get it. How do we get the vast majority of established firms thinking? Neil, from the established firm side.
The first place you start is you need to recognize, you have to get your head out of the sand, I think, first of all. And you need to understand that there is no opportunity just to continue to play, the game we played for the last 10 years. It's just not possible. So as soon as you acknowledge that, then you sort of thinking about yourself in a different light. And it's not about playing defense and sort of holding on. It's about getting back and competing in a much more transparent, much more fluid market for those customers you have. And I think just like any sports analogy, you'd say sort of defending that 2-1 lead is the surest way to lose the game. We got to start thinking that way, and you have to start thinking about how do you reinvent the products you have and the markets you're serving, because if you don't, someone else is going to. And I think that's a mindset change that often you'll need to get over this idea that you may need to cannibalize some of your earnings on that path to either protect your business or grow the business. But it starts there. So I think the first piece is really recognizing the risk of standing still is dramatically higher than the risk of actually moving forward and making some mistake or risking some part of your business. I think that's the fundamental.
Well?
Yeah, there's so many facets to this particular point, but it's fundamental to the growth of any particular startup and any particular business. I would say that large enterprise or enterprise generally needs to engage and needs to engage early. And I go back to my original point about that inflection point. Large enterprise should be terrified of startups, and I'm being quite candid about this, because if they don't engage early enough and that company hits that inflection point, and now it's on that growth trajectory, and frankly, it's an exponential growth trajectory, it's too late. You're now being disrupted. So if you're not in, and Power Corp, I think, is ahead of the game in large part by doing what they did with you, as early as they did with you, because they recognized that there was a new industry. It was going to disrupt their existing industry. And so let's get in early enough before they hit that growth trajectory that will ultimately disrupt my business. And within that, as a large enterprise, large enterprise also needs to understand that they need to start tweaking incentives internally. Because the biggest risk in a large enterprise is having so the CEO gets it, the executive team gets it, but the manager that's responsible for P&L on a particular division that's going to get disrupted is now risking their job and their bonus and their salary on this particular business. So unless you tweak their incentives and you align that across the entire organization, you're always going to get pushback. So I think first and foremost, enterprise at the highest level of leadership need to engage. It's not enough to send to have middle managers or others kind of making those decisions. It has to be from the top down. And then ultimately, you need to align incentives around the opportunity to be disrupted internally.
What do you see when you look at established firms?
The only thing I would add here is, engage. It is such an opportunity to engage, and I think one of the things we noticed when we started, and we talked to so many of the big financial services companies, and at all levels of executive leadership. Some companies were very open-minded about it, and the first perspective was this sort of thing is not something that we're very good at doing internally. Maybe there's a way we could do it together, and that's our access, and that's our ability to innovate. Is it doesn't have to come from within, but we can benefit from other firms that do it out there and find the model for working together. Whereas other firms dismiss innovative technologies they see out there and say, well, if this is something that ever does take off, we can simply replicate it ourselves or buy it later or squash it. And I think Bilal's point is a really good one, that what we've seen in our experience now of about 6 months working with Power Financial is how much they're learning from working with us. And we structured a really beautiful deal where we're a totally independent company, and that I think has been really important to why we can continue to do what we're doing. But the benefits that they get across their broad organization have been tremendous, and I think anybody at that organization would say it. And I think there was a lot of hesitation up front because this isn't something that's really been done before, and there aren't really proven models about how to work with startups out there that are very nimble and fast-moving and like to break things. But I think there's a huge opportunity for firms that do want to engage and do want to support this sort of innovation out there.
And in Mike's example, because I think it's such a great case study, it was Paul Demeray III personally that got involved and started backing this thing. And I think that level of leadership really sends a message to the entire organization about the direction that they want to go in.
I would just add, I think the nimbleness piece is key, because you have, especially, and I think the larger the company, the bigger the impact, which is, and to take ourselves, we're almost 150 years old, so we sort of think about we're the amalgam of 150 years of things that got stacked on top of one another, and sort of being nimble is very hard when these things have been put together with 30-year-old technology sometimes. And we've also, you continue to sort of broaden your business, and it becomes less and less agile. I think one of the things to get around is, how are you sort of carving off more nimble work groups that aren't sort of tied to the legacy business, whether it's culture or attitude or talent or architecture. We've got to figure out, how the businesses are going to operate at different frequencies. Competing on the go forward has got to operate at a much faster development cycle, and there's a reality in terms of, existing scale businesses aren't going to be able to operate at the same, but they're going to have to increase their pace. So how do you do both?
If you look, and I'm sure this is a commercial for the Emerging Stronger 2015 document that you all have in front of you, but if you look in it, there is a Leger poll on kind of views of the business community in Ontario, and two numbers strike me, and I'm just curious to see whether they align with the thinking across the panel, because we really straddle different businesses of different ages and maturities. Are we heading in the right direction in the economy in Ontario? 29% said yes. Are you confident about the economy? 29% said yes. Does that reflect your thinking or not? I'm just curious to do we have a very heterogeneous business community in Ontario, and so the average doesn't mean that much, or does that alignment? I'm curious to see whether you differ from it versus coalesce around it. Neil?
Yeah, I think you need to de-average that. I mean, I think if you look at the distribution of where those, if it was on a scale of 1 to 10, where's the distribution? There's probably, on one end, attackers feeling like we're absolutely in the right place. There's capital flowing, and we're feeling great. I mean, you go into Waterloo, and you probably say, hey, this is feeling pretty buoyant. If you go into Southern Ontario, kind of manufacturing, this doesn't feel good at all. So I would say, the average probably doesn't mean that much. And it depends, sort of what your starting point is.
Well,
yeah, I mean, I think at a high level, the tides are changing. And so we need to recognize as a jurisdiction that there's certain traditional industries that we've relied on for growth and livelihood that frankly won't be here 10 years from now. And if we don't recognize the need to replace those jobs and to replace those industries today in anticipation for that disruption 10 years from now, then we'll be 10 years or 20 years behind every other jurisdiction around the world that's also struggling with this particular problem. So I think, you know, we talk about a low growth cycle or economy or world that we live in right now. It's low growth in large part because we're replacing entire industries and frankly entire economies with new growth economies. And there's going to be a time frame in which that gets implemented. Some will implement it successfully and other jurisdictions will not. And so we need to be part of that, part of the group that is driving to successfully kind of make that transition.
Fascinating. Mike?
I mean, I'm super naive about these things. You know, I graduated from Ivy in 2009, and I actually saw Aaron Corey is in the audience today, who gave me my first job at McKinsey when I graduated. And 2009 was not the most exciting year to enter the workforce. I remember when we went through recruiting that year, you know, I think the first week of interview schedule was the week Bear Stearns went under. And at Ivy, where, you know, the only jobs people wanted were investment banking and consulting, you know, it felt like the world was falling apart. And our starting class at McKinsey was, I think, a fifth the size of the year ahead of us. But I think you know, I'm super naive about these things because I'm an entrepreneur and you just have to make it work. You know, if I wasn't joining McKinsey then, I think I would have been starting a business then. And at the time, well, I think to most people it would have seemed like a terrible time to start a business. You actually see how many wonderful businesses were started in 2008 and 2009, and the ones that were able to persist, you know, grew and rode the entire bull market that kind of, you know, followed that. And same as today. We started our business a year ago, and unlike our U.S. competitors that you said, you know, have been around for a little while, they've had the benefit of riding a bull market in the stock market for the last 7 years, which has certainly helped their case as asset managers. In our world, this summer has been a very tough time to be an investor in the stock market. It's been incredibly volatile. We've heard all about volatility today. But you know, because I'm naive, I see that as all noise. You just have to make it work in whatever environment you're working on, and you know, we certainly plan to do that.
That's a great match. One of the things last night I was really struck by was how passionately our four kind of founders felt about growing and sustaining and building their company in Canada, that resisting the pull to the valley, what have you. And that kind of, you know, I want to ask you about that as well, because it worries me. I mean, we educate, we have great talent in this country, we have great universities, we turn out great graduates, but if they go elsewhere, good for the individual, not necessarily good for Canada. So I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that, and then partially a bit about kind of the brand kind of issue as well. I mean, do we need a bit different? This is up on the screen again if you have a look. On the left-hand side is every time we did polling when I was in government, Canada comes up very highly, but the only characteristic they could associate with Canada was being nice. And the right-hand side gives you a list of things that I think we are, which is great talent, great universities, knowledge economy, strong financial sector, you name it. How do we, you know, resist this pull of elsewhere? How do we build our brand and then make it possible for our best and our brightest and our youngest to achieve their potential here, not somewhere else? Because I think that's going to be one of our great challenges and opportunities going ahead. Mike, you're nodding, so I'll start with you.
I mean, I loved your comment when you started that we have all the ingredients but not the recipe. And I think, has anybody here read the book, Why Mexicans Don't Drink Molson? See a few hands. If not, I highly recommend it. You know, it's exactly this point, and it walks through several different industries with, we have all of the ingredients of success, and beer is a great example. We have, you know, the largest freshwater supply in the world, one of the largest kind of barley, you know, producers in the world, and yet why is it that Mexico, a country that has neither of those things, produces 17 times as much beer, or exports 17 times as much beer as we do? And I think there is a real problem with the Canadian mindset, having lived both here and in Silicon Valley. But I think things are changing, and I think largely, in part to people like Bilal that are trying to help people transition towards this innovation thinking. And I love the remarks earlier about one of the ways to do that is just force Canadians to think globally. You know, our business from day one, we've always struggled with this. In fact, when we raised our initial seed round of capital, we raised from just some remarkable investors that had built world-class asset managers in Canada, and had been phenomenally successful at doing that. And the mentality when we started the business was, let's just focus on winning Canada. Because if we do that, we could build a really wonderful, great business. But that was never our intention. I think partly influenced by the fact that our team that we started with spent 4 years living in Silicon Valley, building a company out there, and you learn to think a little bit more grandiose when you're there. So from day one, we wanted to start a global business. And I think that drive to think beyond Canada's borders is super important. And I think the government can play a really big role in that, in helping to create the right incentives for doing it. As a very specific example, last week I was invited to go with John Tory to the UK as part of a fintech mission with the explicit goal of come meet other fintech companies, other large industry players over there, trying to help incent Canadian financial services, fintech companies to think bigger than Canada. And I think those sorts of opportunities to introduce entrepreneurs and industry to global opportunities is a huge one for Canadians.
Great, thank you. Bilal?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm always torn on this particular question because on one end, I truly believe let him go. Let him go because Canada becomes a stronger ecosystem. We have stronger ties globally, particularly when we talk about the Valley in New York. When they're out there, they're still Canadian. They still feel strongly about what's going on here, and they still engage. However, I am beginning to see this trend more recently, where we're actually seeing entrepreneurs that have built companies in the Valley now wanting to build in Canada. And they are doing this for a number of reasons. First and foremost, because they actually begin to see the ingredients that are here today that weren't here 10 years ago. I think that's an incredibly important piece, in large part around talent. And when you go to places like the Valley, you go to places like New York and others, talent is, it's like trading commodities. It's insane how challenging it is to find talent and to keep talent. And it's getting more and more expensive to do it. And so a lot of entrepreneurs are now saying, well, Canada, and particularly Ontario's got this wealth of academic institutions, talents, and likewise. And now we've got the funding, we've got the resources, we've got a government that begins to understand this stuff. We're building an ecosystem around this, and what I like to call a national pipeline of funding, in which we need to focus on more and more. Happy to talk about that later. But we're seeing entrepreneurs that previously, a decade ago, built in the Valley and are now starting their next venture in Canada. They're now well capitalized. They've got strong ties in the Valley. They have a breadth of experience about how to build a business, and they're doing it here. And I mean, frankly, I think Mike's an example of that as well. He spent time in the Valley, built a business, exited, sold that company, but he decided to build his next business here because today is very different than it was 10 years ago.
Neil?
I would agree. I think most of the points have been covered. I think if the analogy of barley and water, I think in the new economy, it's capital and talent, and that's where I think a lot of these companies were heading to the Valley. And I think to the points being made, you see the capital and the talent in Ontario. And I think we need, if those are the two, and there's a few other ones, we have to make sure that those are the inputs that these organizations have at their disposal locally. And I think if we just look to previous couple decades, I mean, we saw what happened in the medical profession. A lot of the medical talent going to the U.S. because it was in their best interest. We need to make sure that doesn't happen in the digital economy.
Yeah. Is the established financial sector doing as much as it can to be part of, because everybody mentioned, in a sense, government and VCs, not a lot about the established. We do have a large, well-managed, world-class financial. Is there more it can do? I'm not singling out any institution, just the sector itself.
No, I think it's a fair question. I mean, I think we get it. There's things that we're working on now. We do see sort of different roles we play, different maturity stages of a business, and the legacy business is very clear, mature business is very clear. But there are developments that we'd say are relatively recent, like we just launched a generator fund, really to help get in and provide some of that equity. I think our more logical place has historically been in terms of debt capital, and debt capital has risk management that goes with it, and a certain risk appetite and or pricing. But I think it's things like that, or how we work with NACO. For example, we were a sponsor of NACO when we were down here just a few weeks ago with that. So whether it's that, or how do we work with incubators and accelerators, of which is more and more being brought into the DNA of not only how do we support clients and the economy generally, but also just how do we think about our own business? Like where's the next innovation that we're going to take in to help Canadians and their how we provide financial services. And increasingly we're saying we need to have a challenger type function that isn't just tied to the historical talent and model that we had. So I think, absolutely, I think, financial institutions need to do more.
Yeah, I would say I don't think large enterprise in Canada is even in the game, to be honest. And this is frankly, in my opinion, the largest risk for large enterprise is when they're not in the game. Entrepreneurs, I mean, they're an incredible beast, and I feel like I'm sometimes just like, in a safari, and I'm analyzing these animals, because what they do is they don't stop. If the large enterprise is not willing to play, they're going to play around the peripheries of either the regulation, they're going to play around the peripheries of large enterprise, and they're going to figure out a path, they're going to figure out a way, and they're nimble and lean enough to make it all work. Which is, in my opinion, the biggest risk and the biggest fear for any large enterprise. And so by large enterprise not engaging, not playing, not actually being at the table, entrepreneurs, and Uber is a fantastic example of this, they knew they couldn't go into any particular jurisdiction because of the regulatory processes around it. They couldn't go into any jurisdiction and say, we're actually going to start letting drivers drive people around, because the taxi cab industry would have gone nuts. So what did they do? They basically said, listen, we'll create an app that actually helps you find a taxi. That's all we're doing, because we know that we can't do anything else. But once they were embedded in the psyche and the consciousness of pretty much every consumer out there, they were able to flip the switch. And it was as simple as adding a new function to their app. And that literally changed the entire dynamic of things. And so, I'm fascinated with entrepreneurs in large part because they're so hard-headed. They're going to figure out a way to get in. And if you don't let them in the front door, they're going to get in, through the back.
We're going to end it very quickly, but one last question to each of you, 30 seconds each. Typically what we do is we end up, what do you think the 5 biggest problems facing Ontario, Canada are, because we're Canadian? I thought we'd flip that and ask you, what do you think the one biggest opportunity for small business and startups? Let's kind of work on the positive side. Mike, what's the one biggest opportunity out there that we should all be thinking about seizing?
I think people have nailed it here when they talked about talent. I think we actually are ahead of the game when it comes to talent today. And I think that, to actually win the talent war, we need to focus a lot of energy there and really figure out how to keep our talent here, continue to develop it, and enable them to go out and build businesses or join large enterprises to create new opportunities. Between Waterloo and Toronto in particular, there's just such wonderful talent coming out at an amazing pace from these places. We need to do more with it. So I think that's our biggest opportunity and kind of one of the ingredients.
Talent. BILAL?
Yeah, I think the biggest opportunity, particularly for Ontario, is that Ontario's got this incredibly diverse economy. It's amazing. We've got strengths in financial services, life sciences, telecommunications, food processing, automotive. We've done this incredible job of diversifying our economy. And so to intersect each of those growing verticals with technology gives us, frankly, a competitive advantage that very few jurisdictions around the world have. Many jurisdictions are kind of one industry jurisdictions. And even Silicon Valley, frankly, they're technology heavy. But what they struggle with and what they're able to do successfully is actually go around the rest of the United States to find the intersection with industries within the United States that are growing. We're able to do that all within Ontario. And I think that's, frankly, our unfair advantage globally. And we need to tap that well a little bit.
Diversity. Neil?
I guess I think about it in 2 ways, sort of demographics and geography. First one would be just building on everything we just talked about, but I think millennials and just really helping, set up millennials for we know they're going to be disproportionately entrepreneurs versus previous demographics. So how are we setting the conditions for them to be successful? And we've touched on a lot of those conditions because, there's, if Michael graduated in 2009, there's somebody graduating this year that's going to be, building that next business. How are we supporting them? And then the second piece would just be geography. And, if we look at the U.S. is right there, it's this enormous market, and sort of certainty of demand is in the top sort of 3 things that our clients tell us is an impediment, talent being the first. But, exporting, IP and exporting, in a digital economy is a lot different than, loading lumber on a rail car and sending it, to really build communities in the United States. And I think exporting in that to the U.S., frankly, marketplace and supporting millennials, those are the 2 things that I think come together.
Okay.
The only one thing I'd add, and you made the previous question around what large companies can also do to think about this. I think we as Ontarians and Canadians need to think bigger than in Canada and the United States as the global market. It is a massive world out there, and in fact, if you think about what's really going to drive global growth for the next 20 years, you need to have a broader perspective. And financial services is a great example. Plenty of the big banks have a great presence in Canada and a fairly large presence in the US. But how many have a truly, maybe the UK if you throw there too, but beyond that, where are we seizing the opportunities on a global scale? And I think that's something we just need to get better at here in Ontario and in Canada.
So think globally, think talent, think diversity. Great insights from our panel, great optimism about the future. Let's thank them.